For those of you who are here for the first time or haven't been here for a while, we have been studying 2 Samuel and Kings, and the the scriptures are full of really fun Hebrew. And because I had 2 years of Hebrew in seminary, my husband thought it best that I get to do the readings. So it's been a weekly fun thing. Can Mary pronounce this stuff still? Because it's been 25 years since I read a Hebrew alphabet. So here it goes. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verses 5 through 9, 14 through 15, 31 through 33. The king gave orders to Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, "Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom." And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders concerning Absalom. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. The men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the slaughter there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest claimed more victims that day than the sword. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. His head caught fast in the oak, and he was left hanging between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. Joab said, "I will not waste time like this with you." He took 3 spears in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then the Cushite came to David, and the Cushite said, "Good tidings for my lord the king, for the Lord has vindicated you this day, delivering you from the power of all who rose up against you." The king said to the Cushite, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The Cushite answered, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to do you harm be like that young man." The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son."
So tell me there, Pastor, are we ever going to be done with this King David series? I mean, this last week has been awful. Absolutely awful. Fires up and down the West Coast that are burning out of control. So many of my favorite fishing spots and camping spots and things gone. Greenville wiped off the map. Parts of Chester in danger. COVID issues which are causing even more political divisions, and it's terrible. And this story of David's life crashing down around him is getting old, Pastor. It's getting really old. I know. These are not easy passages to read, nor are they easy sermons to preach. And again, this is why I use a lectionary. Because if I didn't, I would have stopped at the story of David and Goliath and went on to something else, right? But I've got to stay disciplined here. You all know that if I had my druthers, I would preach from 3 books, and that would be Job from the Old Testament, Gospel of Mark, and Philippians. Those are my 3 go-to favorite books out of the Bible, and I have 3 sermons. God is always with us, even in the midst of trouble, from Job. Following Jesus isn't always easy, but it's what we're called to do, from Mark. And with God's help, the church can do great things from Philippians. That's it, right? Says it all. But we've got King David. We've got King David this morning, and King David is important for us if we're going to figure out what happened to Israel and why the church is in such a need for a Messiah, and why we affirm Jesus as Messiah. So, A few weeks ago, we determined that even though there's very little good news about how David's life is unfolding and kind of crashing, God always provides a way for good news. Always. And last week we determined that it's good to have wise counselors in our life, like David's prophet Nathan, who kind of call us out on the things that we do and keep us on the straight and narrow. But we also learned that even though God forgives sins, we have to understand that we pay consequence for those sins. And so this week, Mary read about the grief David experienced upon learning of the death of his son Absalom, who rebelled against his father and tried to assume control over Israel's throne. And why did he do this? Because David turned his back on his daughter Tamar when Amnon, one of his sons by another wife, raped her. And this led to Tamar's brother, Absalom, killing his half-brother Amnon for wrecking his sister's life. After that, Absalom launches this campaign to dethrone his father David and take over as king. Once again, it seems like we're going to have to dig really deep to try to figure out what the good news in this story is all about. So my question this morning is, how much of this passage is about David's mourning the loss of his son Absalom, and how much of it is David mourning the loss of his kingdom? Right? Especially his winning streak as Israel's king. What exactly does David regret here? Does he regret turning his back on Tamar because he wasn't willing to hold Amnon accountable against, for his sin against her? Does he regret what he did to Bathsheba and her husband Uriah? Last week we got a little glimmer of hope when David recognized his sin and repented, but it seems like David still is not getting it, right? But why do we even expect him to get it? He got so caught up in the same trap that other kings get caught up into that it's really hard to imagine what could be done to repair all of the damage that has been done. And what's strange about this whole series of events is that despite all the damage that he's caused, David still comes out as Israel's greatest king. From the day of his death until August 8th, 2021 at 10:20 a.m., history remembers him as Israel's greatest king. And the thing is, when you stop and compare, he actually was Israel's greatest king. History has a way of overlooking a ruler's personal faults in favor of their accomplishments. Because show me a leader who has made a significant impact in this world who's lived a blameless life. Don't go there. Don't go there, because we don't know the skeletons in that closet. My peanut gallery here, you right? Of course, we in the Christian church, we affirm the belief that all have fallen short of God's glory in some way, and that none of us, even the Jimmy Carters of the world, can say that we are without blame. But there have been some pretty spectacular sinners who've made a positive change in the world. So it's hard. As much as we've been picking on David for the last month or so, I think that we're a little bit more willing to show him some grace this week because he's mourning the death of his son. But remember, if you've read the books of Samuel from the beginning, none of this tragedy and drama should be a surprise. The ball was already rolling long before David ever became king. This started back in 1 Samuel chapter 8 when the people of Israel demanded a king. And we've said it from day one in this series. God is all about free will. God honors our choices even when they're unwise, even when they are self-destructive. God told Israel, if you insist on having a king like all the other nations, know that you will experience problems like all the other nations. This is not going to end well. But then along comes David, and David starts out fine. When he was humble, when he was the shepherd king that he was called to be, he was awesome. He was great. He was genuinely concerned about what God wanted and not just what he wanted. Things were going well. But then David started believing that he had power over life and death, and that he could use that power to get what he wanted, what he thought he deserved as a king. But then he discovers that he doesn't have power over life and death. He thinks he does. Here, in the story that Mary read here, he tells his commanders, as they're having this conflict, as they're having this war with his son, he says, hey, deal gently with my son Absalom. Even though Absalom would have killed him and anybody else in David's camp. But as we see in this story, his soldiers, led by somebody who David sort of trusted, I mean, probably the last person that David ever trusted, he killed his son mercilessly. Why? Because if they didn't, David might spare Absalom's life, and then he or somebody else would rise up against David and start another rebellion. In another 1,000 years, the Apostle Paul would write in the book of Galatians, chapter 6, verse 7 and 8, do not be deceived. God will not be mocked. For you reap whatever you sow. If you sow to your flesh, you will reap corruption from the flesh. But if you sow from the Spirit, you'll reap eternal life from the Spirit. See, David is just reaping that which he has already sown. Oh, son, if it is only I who would have died. He is the star of this catastrophic production, right? To this day, David is still lifted up as the focal point in this story. All he sees is my son, my son, my son. But he sure didn't see his daughter Tamar. He sure didn't see Uriah. And in the end, it's all about David. But his story ends in pain and brokenness. And so for us, it's not hard to sympathize with him just a little bit, even though he brought this on all himself. Everything Samuel said would happen to Israel when Israel demanded a king, it happened. This is it. And it ends in brokenness. It doesn't end in David being the great hero, doesn't end in him being glorified. It ends in him being broken. He has nobody to blame but himself. And yet, from this point on, David is seen as the emblem of the good old days. If this is Israel's good old days, who was it good for? Was it good for Uriah? Was it good for Absalom? What happens when you read the story of David through the eyes of the women in his life? Was it good for Michal? Bathsheba? Tamar? Again, who was it good for? And this should be a reminder to us that the good old days were not always good for everyone. I mean, we like to lift up the 1950s as our happy days, right? Shoot, we even had a television series called Happy Days about the 1950s. Well, when you think about it, that all depends on who you ask, right? Who experienced the happy days as happy days? Was it good for black folks who were being segregated? Was it good for our indigenous people who were being driven off their land and collected in reservations? Was it good for people like coal miners or factory workers whose lives were in constant danger because their employers were too cheap to provide adequate safety protocols and they got away with it because there were no regulations? Have there been any happy days that everybody can agree on? Help us out here, preacher. Where's the good news? Well, the good news, believe it or not, is right here, right now. Right here, right now. This place is a safe place. It's a sanctuary where we can gather in this strengthening fellowship and share both our troubles and our joys. And there are three important things that we can do in this sanctuary when we are facing difficult times. Number one, we can affirm that God is with us, even in the midst of trouble. Job 42:2. Job says to God, I know that you can do all things, and no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Number two, we can study the life of Jesus and answer his call to follow him even when it's not easy. Mark's Gospel 8:34, Jesus says, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. And the good news here is that following Jesus means we don't have to bear that cross alone. We can bear one another's burdens. Number three, with God's help, the church can do great things. In Philippians 1:6, the Apostle Paul writes, I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work among you will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. Do you see what I just did there? You still managed to get my three favorite books and my three favorite sermons. Now, despite David's sin, despite his shortcomings, he still paved the way for God's plan to unfold. Hannah's song at the very beginning of the books of Samuel laid it all out. God opposed the proud and exalts the humble. Despite human evil, God is still at work. And God would raise up an eternal king that would usher in a reign of justice, mercy, and love for all. Yes, it has been a rough couple of months learning about David's failures. And yes, it's also been a rough couple of months bearing witness to events that are all around us in the here and now. Events that continue to unfold in real time. But there is good news in this place and in this time. Receive it here. Proclaim it out there.